Congressional Procedure, a practical guide to the legislative process in the United States House and Senate. Chapter 6, Resolving Differences between the House and the Senate. Table of Sections. A. Introduction. B. Resolving differences. C. Amendments between the chambers. D. Conference committee. E. Conference reports. F. Failure to take up a measure. G. The president. H. Review questions. A. Introduction. For any legislation to become law, under the Constitution, Article 1, Section 7, both the House and the Senate must pass the same measure. The text of the bill or joint resolution must be identical. Only then is it sent to the President for signature or veto. The House of Representatives is ruled by its majority. The Senate protects its minority. The House has 435 members in rigid rules. The Senate has 100 members in rules and practices that are more malleable in daily practice. The House, with 2-year terms for its members, is often buffeted by waves of public opinion. The Senate, with 6-year terms, is more insulated. The House, in many cases, moves comparatively quickly. The Senate is generally slow moving, even glacial at times. This reflects the design of the framers of the Constitution. So, how do these bodies come together to approve identical text? Having passed sometimes very different versions of legislation, how do they get a bill or resolution to the President? Legislating in Congress involves negotiation, compromise, moderation, and civility. The process of resolving differences between the chambers is no different. While the Congress of recent decades has made legislative compromise seemingly unreachable at times, the Constitution and the rules of the House and Senate compel the chambers to reach accommodation, at least in some circumstances. This is often very difficult and complex. When both the House and Senate chambers share the same majority party, even if the president is also of the same party, it may not be simple. Differing policy views and politics between the chambers or with the president can derail the effort. In the 111th Congress, the Democratic House was able to pass a cap and trade bill in 2009 to address climate change. While the Senate Majority Leader tried for much of the next year, no legislation was passed. Democratic senators from the Midwest were particularly concerned about potential economic impacts, given their state's reliance on coal burning power plants. But when the chambers are run by different parties, it is even more challenging, sometimes insurmountable. A Republican House passed some form of a repeal of Obamacare, for example, more than 50 times between 2011 and 2014. The Democratic controlled Senate never took the bills up. B. Resolving differences. One chamber must pass the product of the other, or they must agree on language added or subtracted. Either way, in the end, the Senate must consider a House measure or the House must consider a Senate measure. When the first chamber to act passes a measure, it messages an engrossed copy of the legislation to the other body. In the second chamber, the measure may be held at the desk or referred to the appropriate committee. The easiest case is if the House passes legislation without amendment sent to it by the Senate, simply adopting the Senate measure. Alternatively, it may be the Senate voting to pass without amendment the language of a House passed bill or joint resolution sent to it. This process usually occurs on measures that are not controversial. When the same party controls both chambers, the House and Senate leadership may take this as the course of last resistance. For example, the passage of the Affordable Care Act, the bulk of Obamacare, one of the most controversial bills of recent decades, was ultimately passed in this fashion. The Democrats at the time controlled both the House and the Senate. The substance of the bill was first passed by the Senate at 7 a.m. on Christmas morning in 2009 by a 60 to 39 party line vote by adding its language onto a minor unrelated House passed bill. The House passed without amendment the Senate amended House bill on March 21st of the following year and sent it to President Barack Obama, who signed the bill into law on March 23rd. Even with control of both chambers, including a 60-vote filibuster-proof majority in the Senate, the Democratic leadership knew that the minority in the Senate could make use of a conference committee or amendments between the chambers extremely difficult. As a result, they ultimately opted for House acceptance of the Senate bill. See Chapter 6D. If this chamber that received the legislation does not pass the identical language, it may pass the measure with an amendment or amendments. Sometimes this is a complete substitute. For example, if the House sends the Senate legislation on a matter, but the Senate has been working on a different version, the Senate will hold the House bill at the desk and will vote to amend it. Technically, it takes unanimous consent to hold a measure at the desk. As a practical matter, many measures at the desk are there due to a blind hold, an informal agreement between the respective party secretaries. If the differences between the House and Senate legislation cannot be resolved by amendments between the Houses, see Chapter 6C, they can attempt to work out differences by creating a conference committee, a temporary committee made up of House and Senate members, see Chapter 6D. If the conference committee is able to reach agreement on language acceptable to the conferees from each chamber, the conference committee issues a conference report, see Chapter 6E, which is sent to each chamber and must be passed by each chamber. No amendments are in order before going to the President's desk. See Amendments and the Chambers. When a message is messaged from one chamber to the other and the second chamber amends the legislation, it is returned to the body that originally passed it. The originating chamber then may accept the amendment. In this case, both chambers having passed the bill or resolution in identical form, it is sent to the President. In the House, the floor manager of the legislation could ask the House to concur in the Senate amendment. Similarly, in the Senate, the manager might ask unanimous consent to concur in the House amendment. In either case, if approved, the bill or resolution would then be sent to the President's desk. However, the originating chamber has the opportunity to further amend the legislation and send it back to the other chamber. For example, the House may concur in a Senate amendment with a further amendment if this is agreed to. Normally, by unanimous consent, the House passed measure with the House amendment to the Senate amendment to the House bill is returned to the Senate. In much the same way, the Senate can concur in a House amendment with a further Senate amendment. However, in the Senate, although the motion to proceed to the House amendment to the Senate measure is non debatable, the actual consideration of the House amendment to which the Senate has concurred or concurred with a further amendment is debatable and could be subject to filibuster. Therefore, if unanimous consent cannot be obtained, it usually is at this point, the option of agreeing to a conference committee must then be considered. This process of amending and further amending can be continued back and forth only 2 times per side. However, if progress is being made and success seems near, the Senate can permit additional rounds of amendments by unanimous consent, and the House can do so with a special rule from the Rules Committee. Colloquial, Colloquially, this back and forth series of amendments is known as ping-ponging the bill. If at some point in this amending process either body decides not to act on the legislation sent to it by the other chamber, the leadership may decide to seek a conference with the other chamber. Otherwise, the legislation may die if neither chamber is willing to relent. The process of going to a conference with the other chamber is a three-step process in either chamber. See Chapter 6D. D. Conference Committee. A conference committee is a temporary ad hoc committee made up of members of the House and Senators. A conference cannot be held unless and until both chambers formally agree to form a conference committee. Conference committees exist to draft a compromise bill that both chambers can accept. Conference committees have played such a significant role in the final shaping of major legislation that they have sometimes been referred to as the Third House of Congress. Convening a conference requires 3 steps in each chamber. The first step is to formally disagree with the version sent to it by the other chamber and insist on its own measure. Usually, it is the chamber that first approved the measure that acts first, but the second chamber, upon passing its version, may insist on its amendments and request a conference. Step 2 is to request a conference. And the third and final step toward convening a conference committee is the appointment of conferees by the presiding officer. The conference is formed only if the second chamber insists on its amendment, accepts the request for a conference, and appoints its conferees. In the Senate, each of these 3 steps is carried out by debatable motion. Since debatable matters in the Senate are generally subject to filibuster, there can sometimes be a problem getting the measure to conference if a significant number of senators, 41 to oppose cloture, are sufficiently opposed to the legislation that they do not want a conference committee to be convened. Until 2013, the possibility existed that a determined group of senators, or potentially even one, could create an enormous obstacle by filibustering each of the 3 motions necessary to form a conference committee, thereby making the process time consuming and perhaps insurmountable. For example, in 2009, the Democratic majority in the House passed the Affordable Care Act. The Democratic Senate subsequently passed a similar bill on a party line vote, which contained several provisions that the House was unwilling to agree to. These had been added to attract the final 3 Democrats needed to overcome a Republican filibuster. The potential for the considerable delay a filibuster would cause, and the narrow margin for error to overcome such filibusters, even though there were 60 Democrats in the Senate, weighed heavily in the Democrats' decision not to seek a conference. In 2013, the Senate made a change to the standing rules of the Senate, allowing the 3 necessary motions to get to conference to be made in a single non divisible motion, thus reducing the potential number of filibusters from 3 to 1. Also, in that rules change, the possible debate time allowed after cloture was invoked on this motion was reduced from 30 hours to only 2 hours. Senate Rule 28. When a conference is convened, conferees are numbered by each chamber. In the House, the Speaker, under House Rule 1, appoints conferees. In the Senate, the presiding officer is typically given the authority by unanimous consent to name conferees, formally managers on the part of the Senate. These decisions in both bodies are generally made through consultation with the committee chair and the party leadership. Usually, senior members of the committees of jurisdiction are appointed, but there is wide discretion. Sometimes more junior members are included, and possibly even members who do not sit on the committee of jurisdiction, and perhaps representation from the leadership. The number of conferees from each chamber can range widely. However, since conference committee decisions are made by the majority of each delegation, as opposed to a majority vote of all conferees, the relative size of House and Senate delegations plays no significant role, and each chamber can decide to name any number of conferees it chooses. A motion to instruct conferees can be made in the House, but such a motion, if adopted, expresses the view of the body. The motion is not binding. Motions to instruct are rare in the Senate. Such a motion is debatable with a filibuster possible in the Senate and is subject to amendment. Conference committee meetings are open to the public unless conferees vote to close them. As described in a CRS report by Elizabeth Ribicki, there are almost no rules governing procedure in conference. Conferences are negotiating forums, and the two chambers allow conferees to decide for themselves how best to conduct the negotiations. Conference Committee and Related Procedure, an Introduction, CRS Report 96 708. While conference committees have wide latitude as to how they conduct their negotiations, they are limited in scope by the rules of both chambers. That is, they may not consider language not passed by either chamber, nor new spending provisions, whether specific discretionary appropriations or mandatory spending, not in either the House passed or the Senate passed version. Such new material is sometimes referred to as airdropped into the conference report. If members of the House believe that the conference has exceeded its authority, by including provisions outside the scope, a point of order may be made in the House. These are rare, and to preclude them, the House Rules Committee may adopt a special rule for the conference report that waives all points of order. In the Senate, under Rule 28, a point of order can also be made if the conference report exceeds the scope of the conference. The point of order can be waived by a three-fifths vote the point of order can be waived by a three-fifths vote of senators chosen and sworn, usually 60. The Senate overruled such a point of order in 1996 that, in effect, negated the rule by precedent. Therefore, no out-of-scope rule applied until the Senate reinstated the application of the rule at the start of the 107th Congress 5 years later. Some conferences are more formal than others. Actual formal meetings of the conference committees can be few, even just one. Informal closed meetings, particularly of the majority party in some cases, can resolve the differences and present the conference with the fait accompli. For example, in 2003, the Republican controlled Congress wrote the final Medicare prescription drug pill wrote the final Medicare prescription drug bill, PL 108 173, by abandoning the traditional formalities of a conference committee, excluding most Democrats, including Minority Leader Tom Daschle, a major Democratic leader on the bill, and House Ways and Means Committee Chair Charlie Rangel, a Democrat from New York. Since that time, the pattern of excluding the minority when the same party holds the majority in both chambers has, in turn, made it more likely that senators in the minority party will block the process of going to conferences by threatened or actual filibusters. Often informal pre-conferences are held, usually by the House and Senate committee staff to work out differences in advance as a way of facilitating the work of the formal conference if one is held. On occasion, pre-conferencing can begin even before the second chamber has completed action on the bill. An example is the landmark Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, ANILCA, passed in 1980, PL 96-847. The House passed a version of the bill in May 1979. The following year, 1980, the Senate Energy Committee reported its version. On the Senate floor, Senator Paul Tsongas, a Democrat from Massachusetts, was successful in a test vote, demonstrating the votes were a complete substitute for the bill favored by environmental groups. Alaska Senior Senator Ted Stevens, a Republican from Alaska, launched a filibuster. Minority Leader Robert Byrd, a Democrat from West Virginia, pulled the bill from the floor and instructed the principals to attempt to negotiate a compromise. Energy Committee Chair Scoop Jackson, a Democrat of Washington, Tsongas and Stevens launched a negotiation that lasted for months, later expanded into essentially an informal conference with the House Interior Committee led by Chair Mo Udall, a Democrat of Arizona. The product of the informal conference passed the Senate in August and was accepted by the House and signed into law in December 1980 by President Carter just weeks before leaving office. No formal conference ever occurred. In the era of partisan polarization in both the House and Senate, the leadership frequently bypasses formation of conference committees altogether. Fewer conferences have been occurring, particularly when both chambers are controlled by the same party. The House and Senate leadership seek to avoid a full scale conference to both reduce minority party involvement in the decisions and to reduce the opportunities for minority obstruction. The polarization has led to more powerful central leadership in both chambers, and those leaders are more likely to want to keep control of the process of resolving differences and negotiating bicameral agreements. Professor Stephen S. Smith wrote in The Senate Syndrome, as the partisan divisions continue to deepen, party leaders were expected to play a more central role in the process of reconciling House Senate difference. A natural corollary and more leadership involvement was less exclusive reliance on the committee leaders and the formal conference process. Smith reports that conference committee participation in measures enacted into law fell from 13% in the 103rd Congress, 1993 to 1994, to only 2% in the 110th Congress and 3% in the 111th Congress, ending in 2010. This pattern has largely continued. E-conference reports E-conference reports. When consideration by the conference committee is complete, it will recommend that either the House recede from all or certain of its amendments, or that the Senate recede from all or certain of its amendments, or both. Rarely will a conference committee report the inability to reach an agreement. A majority of both House and Senate delegations to the conference is necessary to agree to a conference report to be sent to each chamber. Once the conference committee has reached agreement, its recommendation in the form of a conference report and an accompanying joint statement of managers, which explains the decision made by and the intent of the conferees, is prepared. Conferees must indicate their approval by signing both the conference report and the joint statement of managers. Typically, the conference report will go first to the chamber that agreed to the conference rather than the chamber that requested the conference. The conference report is not open to further amendment. In the first chamber to consider the conference, a member can move to recommit the bill to the conference committee. But once the first chamber has passed the conference report, the conference committee is dissolved and the second chamber to act can no longer recommit the bill to the conference because it no longer exists. In both the Senate and the House, a conference committee is a privileged member. In both the Senate and the House, a conference report is a privileged matter. In the House, this means that once the official papers are received, the conference report can be taken up at almost any time. In the Senate, this means that the motion to proceed to a conference report is not debatable and cannot be filibustered, the conference report itself is subject to filibuster once the Senate is debating it. Like all legislative filibusters, ending debate requires invoking cloture with a three-fifths vote. If the conference report is rejected by either chamber, the other body is notified. A new conference may or may not be sought. When both chambers have reached final agreement, an enrolled copy of the bill or resolution will be prepared. This is the final official copy. The measure is printed on parchment and certified by the Secretary of the Senate or the clerk of the House, depending on which body first passed it. The bill or resolution is then signed by the Vice President and the Speaker of the House. The measure is then delivered to the President for his signature or veto. F. Failure to take up a measure. One of the most rancorous disagreements between the chambers often occurs when one body simply turns a blind eye to legislation sent over from the other body. This brings to mind the probably apocryphal story of George Washington explaining the need for the Senate to Thomas Jefferson, see Chapter 1A. Washington pointed out that Jefferson was pouring the hot tea from his cup and sipping it from the saucer. He compared this to the role of the Senate cooling the legislation driven by popular passions. Overwhelmingly, in the current context, it is the hot tea, in Washington's words, from the House pouring into the Senate saucer, not to cool as in the famous analogy, but perhaps to congeal, especially when the chambers are run by different parties. The prolific House peppers the Senate with legislation, and much of that legislation simply dies in the Senate. As mentioned above, from 2011 to 2014, the Republican House voted repeal of Obamacare repeatedly, more than 50 times. The Democratic Senate did not respond. Then Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, a Republican of Kentucky, late in 2014 complained the House passed over 300 pieces of legislation, many of them on a bipartisan basis, and nothing was done with them in the Senate. But the differences between the bodies and their rules assure that even when the same party controls both the House and the Senate, the House will send many bills to the Senate that will not be taken up. The leverage afforded the minority party and individual senators of both parties can slow down the pace of House bills in the Senate and frequently block them entirely. Philip Bump of the Fix blog at The Washington Post, using data from GovTrack, looked at the numbers in 2014. He discovered that there were nearly 200 or more House bills left unaddressed by the Senate in every single Congress over the past 40 years. Interestingly, the largest pileup of House legislation over all that time was in the 110th Congress, 2007 and 2008, when more than 700 bills passed by then new Democratic Speaker Nancy Pelosi, a Democrat of California. Democratic House died in the Senate, headed by Democratic Majority Leader Harry Reid, a Democrat of Nevada. Frustrated by criticism at the time, Reid remarked that he wished that, like the Speaker, he could rule with an iron fist. It should also be noted that a smaller number of bills passed by the Senate are left unaddressed in the House. A good example involves the politically complicated subject of immigration reform. In both 2006 and 2013, the Senate passed a bipartisan comprehensive immigration reform bill. In 2006, the Senate voted 62 to 36 for the Comprehensive Immigration Act. Speaker Dennis Hastert, a Republican of Illinois, refused to bring the Senate bill to the House floor. In 2013, the Senate voted 68 to 32 to pass the Border Security, Economic Opportunity, and Immigration Modernization Act. This time it was Speaker John Boehner, a Republican of Ohio, who refused to allow the House to consider the Senate bill. In each case, the president strongly supported the legislation. President George W. Bush in 2006 and President Barack Obama in 2013 to no avail. At times, the knowledge that the minority in the Senate will prevent a particular bill from advancing in the Senate can be a spur to the passage of legislation in the House because it amounts to a free pass. Members can vote for legislation without the risk of being held accountable for negative outcomes. This may particularly explain the ability of congressional Republicans to call for and in the House to adopt repeal of the Affordable Care Act repeatedly. When they gained control of both chambers in 2015, they were unable to repeat that feat, even though the procedure they were using, budget reconciliation, precluded a filibuster in the Senate. G. The President. When a measure has been approved by the House and Senate, an enrolled copy is transmitted to the President. Article 1, Section 7 of the Constitution grants the President 10 days, not counting Sundays, to act on a measure once it has been presented to him or her. The President may sign the bill or joint resolution making it law. Alternatively, the President may allow the legislation to become law without his signature by allowing the 10-day period to elapse. If the President wishes to disapprove the measure, he or she may veto it and return the legislation to the House or Senate. Depending on which body originated the measure, it is returned without his or her approval, together with objections in writing, normally referred to as a veto message. A veto by the President may be overridden and the measure enacted, the objections of the President to the contrary notwithstanding. Overriding a presidential veto requires a two-thirds vote of members voting, a quorum having been established in each chamber of the Congress. If Congress overrides the measure with the necessary two-thirds vote, it is not returned to the President. The override is certified by the Clerk of the House and the Secretary of the Senate, and the bill is sent to the National Archives and the bill becomes law. If either chamber fails to provide the two-thirds necessary to approve the vetoed measure, the veto is sustained and the measure does not become law. The President has an alternative course to disapprove the President has an alternative course to disapprove a measure, frequently called a pocket veto. If the Congress adjourns during the 10-day period in which the President must sign the measure, it does not become law and is not returned to the Congress. Such a veto cannot be overridden. The transmittal of the congressionally enacted bill to the President by the enrolling clerk can be within hours or delayed for weeks. On occasion, this timing may be related to preventing the President from pocket vetoing a bill or resolution by avoiding a period of adjournment. Both the House and the Senate have also, on rare occasion, designated the Clerk of the House or the Secretary of the Senate to receive a vetoed bill from the President in an effort to block the use of the pocket veto. Vetoes are very difficult to override. In the history of Congress from 1789 through early 2018, presidents have exercised their veto power 2,574 times. 1,066 of these were pocket vetoes. Of these, 111 were overridden by the Congress, a mere 4% of all vetoes. Nonetheless, all presidents, with the exception of President John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, have had bills they have vetoed overridden. One prominent veto override occurred in 1986 when the Senate voted 78 to 21 to override President Ronald Reagan's veto of sanctions against the apartheid government in South Africa. The House had previously overridden the bill. The bill therefore became law. In 1996, a near override occurred when the House voted 286 to 129 to override President Bill Clinton's veto of the bill to ban late term abortions. However, in this case, the veto stood when the Senate failed by two votes to override 58 to 40. Because vetoes are so difficult to override, the threat of a veto from the president usually plays a powerful role in the Congress of legislation Because vetoes are so difficult to override, the threat of a veto from the president usually plays a powerful role in the course of legislation through the Congress. In most circumstances, the Congress will attempt to take steps to avoid a presidential veto by modifying offending language. On rare occasions, however, the Congress welcomes the battle. When the president vetoes a bill, the Congress need not and sometimes does not act. This is usually This is usually an indication that the president has the votes to sustain the veto in at least one of the two chambers. Even if one chamber votes to override, the other may decline to take it up. One form of veto that presidents don't have is the line item veto. The line item veto would permit the president to reject individual items within a bill rather than be required to accept or reject the entire legislation. Governors of most states are able to exercise some form of a line item veto. Presidents of both parties for more than a century have supported some form of line item veto. For many in Congress, the line item veto is seen as an abdication of its constitutional role as a check and balance to the president. See Chapter 7, Part O. Congress has for a number of years relied upon larger bills with an array of provisions. This is particularly true in the appropriations process where omnibus appropriations bills, see Chapter 7H, that fund many departments and agencies of the government in one huge bill, have become almost routine in recent years. Such bills frustrate presidents because they cannot isolate and veto the parts of the bill that they oppose, sometimes forcing them to sign a bill even though they believe it to be seriously flawed. In 1996, Congress actually enacted a version of the line item veto that President Clinton signed into law. Line Item Veto Act of 1996, PL 104 to 130. Clinton used that new power to strike 82 items from 11 different laws. Congress overrode the particular line item veto 28 times. In 1998, the Supreme Court in Clinton versus New York City, 524 U.S. 418, 1998, struck down the line item veto by a 6 to 3 vote, declaring it unconstitutional. Justice John Paul Stevens, writing for the majority of the court, declared this act gives the president the unilateral power to change the text of duly enacted statute. He wrote that line item vetoes of this sort are the functional equivalent of partial repeals of acts of Congress. Part H, review questions. Is there a problem if House conferees outnumber Senate conferees on a particular conference committee? What are the two types of presidential vetoes? How may each be overridden? Why did the Senate in 2013 provide the three necessary motions to get to a conference could be combined into one indivisible motion? What are the two ways used to reconcile the House and Senate versions of a measure? What are the advantages of each? Why are conference committees used less often in recent Congresses? What is a pocket veto? Explain what is generally meant by the scope of Congress if a senator believes the scope has been violated in a conference report. What is the remedy available? Why do presidents favor a line item veto?